Oh,
Do you need help?
yeah. I just hit the button though. I think I told it to record. I got to the part where it says go live,
Okay, let
and
me
I
see
hit
if
that,
it's.
and it took me here. I got nervous, so and this is lesson 4. It was prepared.
Okay.
I asked Wayne if this was fourth, and he said it's the fourth class period. You did the first one, so it should be number 4 then. Does that make sense? But
Lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. So it's titled lesson 4, but
Judge for yourself. She said that.
it's live, so you're good.
so, but why don't I see it counting? I really like that counting.
I'm not sure.
And saying past due, that doesn't bother you at all? Okay, so we're in.
We need to go ahead and get started. I don't know if it's the holiday season or perhaps the sicknesses that seem to be going around, but our number seems to be a little down tonight. And so maybe want to check on those that we normally see here. If we don't see them, maybe see if everything's okay in their life and encourage them in some way or form to be back with us. We do have visitors tonight. We're grateful for your presence. Glad that you're here. We're in Joshua chapter 9, if you want to open your Bibles there. Give just a brief overview or recap of what we're doing in this class in a very short and quick amount of time. And that is that we are studying through this book from a particular angle or a particular slant. That is a statement that's made at the end of the book in chapter 23 and verse 14, where it says that not one promise that God had made to Israel failed. And so we're basing our class around the idea that God can be trusted. Trusted to be faithful to His promises even when, and maybe even especially when, we're unfaithful to the promises that we've made to Him. Doesn't mean an unconditional blessing or an unconditional salvation, that we could never do anything that God would reject us for, but even that is in God's promises, right? That when we fail Him and turn our backs, He will eventually give up on us and allow us to go the way we've chosen to go. That still is in keeping with the promises that God has made. And so we're trying to take an ancient story and an ancient text and bring it into modern application. I don't know if any of us will ever enlist in an army, fight in a war, take a land, encircle a city, but we all are called to live faithfully and obediently to God, and in our shortcomings, God is still faithful to us. So I want to start tonight with an adaptation of a quotation. Back in the late or early 1800s, a Navy commander named Oliver Hazard Perry, after defeating a British naval fleet on Lake Erie, said, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Now, that might not mean a whole lot to us, but it simply means we found them and we defeated them and we've captured them. Well, fast forward about 150 or 60 years or so, in 1970, Walt Kelly adapted that quotation and used it in reference to the first annual observance of Earth Day. And he said, "We have found the enemy, and the enemy is us." Speaking specifically of how we use our resources and how we've treated the things that God has given us. I would suggest to you tonight that if Joshua were to take that quote and he were to make application of that quote in Joshua chapter 9, he would say something like this: "We have found the enemy, and the enemy is our neighbor." That's Joshua chapters 9 and 10, particularly about half of chapter 10 and all of chapter 9. You see, in Joshua 6, 7, and 8, Israel sinned. How did Israel sin in 6, 7, and 8?
Achan stole from the forbidden treasures of Jericho and buried them, and so when they went to fight at Ai, they were soundly defeated.
Absolutely. So a willful act of greed on behalf of one man affected the entire nation. Was God still faithful to Israel even in their willful disobedience? Yes. He provided the discovery of that sin, the restitution for that sin, and then the victory following that sin. God was faithful despite their willful disobedience. Well, in our text tonight, Israel sins again. This time it's not because of a willful act of disobedience. It's really from neglect, distraction, and deceit. And so if we're going to give a title to our thoughts tonight, it is that our God is faithful even when we are distracted and deceived. Even when we're fooled into doing something that we shouldn't do or following a path we shouldn't follow, that God's still there to correct and bring us back and fix that, to restore us and to protect us. In fact, I would go out on a limb and tell you that God protects the deceived and the deceiver in our text, both the one who perpetrated the lie and the one who fell to it. And I think in our lives today, the same thing is true. There are times that we're deceived. There are times that maybe even we engage in deception. And yet, in the long run, if we're faithful and we return and we acknowledge God, He will still be faithful to us, forgive us, restore us, and use us even in the midst of that. lest we don't get there. Okay, and that's always a possibility in a 45-minute Bible class. It's actually always a possibility in my Bible class, whether it's 45 minutes or an hour and 45 minutes. Possibility we won't get there. I want us to go to the end of the story tonight, and I want us to see God's deliverance. Now, I've wrestled with in my mind whether to read the entirety of this. I'm not going to do all of it, but if you begin in chapter 10 and verse 7, the Bible says, "So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. None of them shall stand before you." Does that not sound like what God has said to Joshua on multiple occasions already in this book? You go and fight, and I'll be there. They won't stand before you. They won't defeat you. Now, the circumstance of this is different. In fact, the reason they're going to have to fight, we're going to explore and look at as we develop the text tonight and look together at it. But God offers the same type of deliverance. And yet, if you follow, the text is actually chapter 10, verse 7, all the way through chapter 10, verse 15. But there are a couple of things that happen that make this particular defeat of the enemy different than any other defeat of the book. In fact, the narrator is going to say that there hasn't been a fight like this, and God really, if you want to use maybe more modern terms, God hasn't shown up in a fight like this for Israel in their past and maybe not in their future again. What two things happen? If you're just going to kind of breeze through the text there and look down, if you'll center in about verse 11 and 12, what did God do to ensure this victory that was different than the other victories that He had given them? Okay, the text actually says God threw hailstones, right? That's an amazing and unique image to me, that God threw hailstones. Now, probably the language is accommodating, but I picture, whatever God's hand looks like in heaven with this big hailstone, and just He keeps throwing one after the other, and perfect aim at hitting them. What else does He do? He makes the sun stand still. The miracles, what's that? And the moon, right? So he stops the natural processes of things, and He throws these hailstones down, all to give them a victory in this context. I'm going to tell you, I don't know that I have the answer for why in this context, but it is phenomenal. In a context when God could have said, listen, you made the mess yourself. If you can win the fight, go win the fight. If you can defeat the enemy, go defeat the enemy. But you were deceived. The people that you're defending are the ones that deceived you. You have at it. Thanks be to God that that's not the way He treats His people. Can you imagine if that was His reaction to us when things get difficult and desperate in our lives? Have you ever had to go to God, beg for help, beg for mercy, beg for forgiveness, beg for deliverance because of a situation that you created? Because of a choice that you made? A decision that was all on you to go with and to live out, and yet God still remained faithful in those moments? I don't know why in this case it's different, but God doesn't just allow them victory. He doesn't just pave a way. He is actively involved in the throwing of hailstones and the stopping of time so that this victory can be theirs. Now, if you've never studied Joshua 9 and 10, you're going to be a little bit surprised at how this all plays out. If you have, and you're like me, it may be one of those that you'd like to revisit and study more, because it's just a unique and interesting scenario that plays out. So let's look at it together. Let's look at chapter 9. Let's put the chapter in context for just a moment. What two cities have been defeated so far on this side of the Jordan? Jericho and Ai. Where were they located geographically in the land?
Just north and northwest of the Dead Sea.
Okay. If you were going to divide the land into north, south, and central, where would this fall? This would be central. Okay. And there's really only one place left to take in this central area that would give them a monopoly of the land in that central area. So they take Jericho and Ai, and the Gibeonites, the Havites, that's really the only place left. If they get that place, they've got a strategic hold in the land where they can fend off from the north, they can fend off from the south. and they hold a strategic place in the promised land. And so that's where we still are. Now, you're going to find, and we're probably not going to spend a lot of time in doing it, but as you read Joshua, remember, we're not covering every story, we're not covering every chapter, you're going to find that they do pursue south, and they do pursue north, and they defeat the rest of those kings, but getting this strip of land in the middle is really strategically important for them. And so that's kind of where we are in the acquisition and conquering of the land. Some of the themes that sort of run through this chapter I think are important for us to point out before we look at the text itself. First of all, there is a recurring theme of deception. In fact, I would suggest to you there is a recurring theme of deception throughout the entire book of Joshua. What is the first deception that we read about in the book? Think about it. I wasn't here to cover it. It was one of the many times it seems like in this quarter of study that I have been sick. But what was the first major deception that we read about? We sometimes spend a lot of time arguing about whether or not it was right, whether or not God blessed it. Rahab and Jericho. And Rahab lied, said she didn't have the spies, and then because of her faithfulness, the Bible says God rewarded her. I'm glad I wasn't teaching that moment, and you can argue with Tyler about that wherever he stands on that deception. But you have deception by Rahab. What's the second major deception in the book? Achan's deception. Here in our text, you're going to have the third major deception, the deception of the Gibeonites. Now, not to give away what happens in the text if you haven't read it yet, I would suggest you that most would agree that the deception of the Gibeonites is more like in kind to the deception of Rahab than the deception of Achan. Both seem to be spurred on by some sense of reverence and respect or fear of Jehovah, what they had heard and what had provided them their motivation. Doesn't make it right what they did. In fact, they're going to get themselves and Israel into a bind because of their deception, but there's deception. In fact, some of the more similarities between the Rahab situation and the Gibeon situation is that both were saved as a result of their deception. Both duped someone. Rahab duped the king, and the Gibeonites duped the Israelites. But nevertheless, there was some commonality there. There's also this reoccurring theme of success and failure, of victory and defeat. That we talk about. What's the book of Judges all about? One word, the book of Judges. Anybody? Not Joshua, Judges. One word. Okay? It is about judges. Why was there a need for judges? What did Israel keep doing? They kept rebelling. They kept losing, right? They kept failing, and God kept defeating them, and they had to have someone rise up. And so in contrast, what do we sometimes, if the book of Judges is about failure and sin, what do we say the book of Joshua is about? Success and victory. But you know, here we are 2 major stories into the account, and you have failure 2 different times. See, the story of mankind is never a story about victory alone, ever. I don't care what generation you live in, how good you are, how faithful you are, how righteous you are. The story of mankind is never fully about victory unless God's a part of the equation. Victory only comes when God clears the way, when God clears the land. In fact, I would argue that Judges is just as much about victory as it is about failure, because every time they fail and they are persecuted, what does God do for them? He provides victory. He provides deliverance. And so the story of mankind is going to be failure unless God is fully recognized and appreciated. And when He's not, failure is going to be a result of that. There's also a theme in chapter 9. You can find the words in verse 1, verse 3, verse 9, verse 16. Over and over again, he says, and they heard. And what they heard spurred on their actions. Okay, so when the nations heard about Ai and Jericho, they sprang into action against God, against God's people. When the Gibeonites heard, they sprang into action to go submit and find refuge in God's people. And then when Israel heard they had been fooled, they acted in response. And that's because we don't really act or react out of nothing. Okay, the way we act and the way we react and the things that we do are all a result of the information that we process, whether that information is right or wrong. Whether it's failed information or right information, A lot of times we'll say something like, well, I said that without thinking, or I did that without thinking. It's actually not technically true. It might be true for one person in every 1,000 because of an inability to think and process. But for the average person, what we do is a result of what we think. It's a result of the information that we process. And so Joshua points that out to us by the use of those terms throughout this particular chapter and event in the history of Israel's existence. All right, so let's look together at the text. Somebody read, if you don't mind. We're not going to do this with every section. If you don't mind, read verses 1 and 2. There's some big names there, but there are familiar big names because they're the names of the nations. Verses 1 and 2, somebody.
Now it came about when all the kings were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and on all the coast of the great sea, Lebanon, the Hittite and the Amorite, Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard of it. So they gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel.
All right, so there are a couple of things about these opening verses that I think are important to set the stage for why the Gibeonites react the way that they do. Now, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but in verse 1, there is a double listing of the people in the land. And what two ways are the people of the land described in verse 1? What two lists do you have? Okay, well, you have location, where they're located, and then you have what they're known as, what their name is. And I think that the point of this, you could have just had one or the other, right? And it would have sufficed. You could have listed their geography, you could have listed their nationality or their name, but he lists both of them. I think what we're supposed to read when we read this is that they were fully aware of what was going on. Either by name or by location, the whole land knew that God was at work among his people, that God had brought them over the Jordan, that God had encircled Jericho, that God had taken Ai. This was a double list to emphasize how aggressive they were going to be and how active they were going to be. What I find most interesting, though, about these opening verses is the reference to what they were going to do. You see, they formed this coalition. You're going to find another coalition formed in chapter 10. You're going to find another one formed in chapter 11. But they decided to band together to defeat God's people, to defeat God. Theologically, it was the worst mistake they could have ever made, right? They weren't going to win. And no matter how many kings you get together and how formidable you are, you're not going to win. And it's not because Jerusalem, or not because Israel is so powerful. It's because the God that supplies them and sustains them throws hailstones, right? And stops time. He's going to win no matter what. They didn't realize that. I want to wonder, though, and maybe a stopping point to ask a question or two, why the change? Somebody look back at chapter 5. Look back at chapter 5. What was the description of the people of the land about God and God's people in 5:1? Their hearts melted with fear. There was, some versions say there was no spirit within them. They weren't going to fight, right? They weren't, if they did, it was going to be simply a suicide mission. They knew they were going to lose. There was no hope for them. Now, why in chapter 9, and this is open-ended because I don't know that there's a definite answer for it. Why in chapter 9, all of a sudden, are they willing and ready now to band together and fight? I can think of two possible reasons, but I'll open the floor for yours.
AI did all right for a while.
Okay. I have actually read guys who think that the it that they refer to here, they heard about it and then they banded together, was not Jericho and Ai's defeat. They heard about Ai's victory. That small, momentary victory, that had been perpetrated. You know, when you have no hope at all, when you have no spirit in you, when your heart's melted, you'll take any piece of good news, right? Even if it's false good news. Even if there's no way that that could be sustainable, you'll cling to hope even when there is none. And maybe that's it. Maybe that's one of the reasons I have. Maybe they heard of Ai, and that is Ai's momentary win, and they thought, here's our window. Let's go in and fight now, because they weren't vulnerable before. There was no defeat before. but now we've heard of their defeat. What's another reason maybe that they changed their mind? That's the second one on my list. Is we have no record in chapter 5 of there being any unity among these Canaanite nations. They had no coalition, no agreement. I would dare say they probably had learned to live at peace with one another. But being a heathen society that they were, driven by selfishness and fleshly desires, there's probably a time when they had friction among themselves, just like the nations of our world do today. Even though we recognize boundaries, we've seen even in the recent months of the Ukraine and Russia saga that sometimes those boundaries aren't respected. Sometimes men cross right over them. And so there apparently didn't seem to be unity, and maybe they thought if we're ever going to win, we need to band together. Now, I will tell you that's a biblical principle, right? It's biblical thought that if we're going to win and be successful, we need to be united and band together and be one in heart and aim. There was another instance in the Old Testament earlier in Genesis where when the Tower of Babel was being built. Remember what God said about their unity? He said they were so united that He knew whatever they wanted to accomplish, they were going to accomplish. That's why He went down and confused their languages. By the way, another instance when God got actively involved in defeating a people who were going to rise up against His people in righteousness. And so there's some similarities there in that instance. But for whatever reason, whatever it might have been, they were ready to go fight. They said with one accord, with one mouth, with one resolve, that we're going to go fight. Now, in contrast to that, to all of these nations that were listed there, and all of their collective brain power and thoughts and planning, there were the Gibeonites. They were the exception. Let's begin reading in verse 3. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard of what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they also acted craftily, shrewdly, cunningly. But their acting was different. They set out as envoys and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys and wineskins worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and had become crumbled. And they went up to the camp of Joshua to the camp of Gilgal, and said to him, men of Israel, we have come from a far country, now therefore make a covenant with us. So what was their approach? Wasn't I'm going to fight and win. What was it? Right. We sometimes say either beat them or join them. I'll join them. I'll be satisfied in making a peace treaty and a covenant. Now, I'll tell you this: the location of this place is about 7 miles southwest of Ai and about 9 miles from Jerusalem. And so, for the most part, they had a front row seat to what happened at Ai and Jericho. Most of these other people, most of these other Canaanite nations and tribes had not seen firsthand. They had just heard. I'm going to go on a limb and say that some of these people may have seen carnage. They have heard screams. They may have known of the cries. I don't know. They were a lot closer to the situation. And so they decided we'll fake being foreign, being destitute, and we'll throw ourselves at the mercy of Israel. I believe that the people of Gibeon knew more about God's commands to Moses and Joshua than we might first think. Can you picture this scenario? They're going 7 miles, 8 miles, 9 miles, somewhere in that range, and yet they look like they've been traveling for 40 years. Did you notice the description? Their bread was moldy. Their sandals were worn out. I don't know if there's any play on words or anything like that, but how's the clothing and the footwear of Israel described after 40 years in the wilderness? Sandals didn't wear out. Clothes didn't wear out. Some suggest that Gibeon looked like another Israel in need of a Yahweh. they needed something. The appeal to the mercy and to the grace and to the forgiveness of a people. I think they knew about God's law. I think they knew about God's character. They knew about the character of God's people. Aren't there people that you know that are God-fearing, God-honoring, and you know no matter what you ask for their forgiveness, they give it? I hope and pray that we are the kind of people that are known like that. And I'm not suggesting that Israel had been so godly and so righteous and so moral and so forgiving that that's how they were represented, but they knew something, didn't they? Maybe this was one lone act of desperation. I think it had more to do with what they actually knew. You see, Gibeon is going to end up being a part of Benjamin's tribal inheritance and appointed as a Levitical city, according to chapter 21 and verse 17. This is going to be a special and unique place. They sought to make this treaty. Going back to the idea they acted craftily. If you drop down to verse 23 of our text, we won't have time to read all of it, you're going to find that as a result of their deception, they're going to be cursed. What does that sound like? Deception and curse. That's Satan in the garden. Here, God's people are trying to do what's right, trying to live right, and you have someone come along, deceive them, and have a curse placed upon them as a result of that. Again, this idea of what they would do. Let's keep reading in verse 6. Verse 6 says, now Joshua, they went to Joshua and they asked to make a covenant. Verse 7, the men of Israel said to the Havites, perhaps you are living within our land. How then shall we make a covenant with you? I have no reason to know why they thought this, but they should have responded with their gut feeling to begin with, right? This doesn't seem right. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't look right. Maybe you're part of the land. And so they said, no, we've come from a long ways away. He asked them again in verse 8, who are you and where you're from? They said, we're your servants. We've come from a far country. And then what do they tell them in verses 9 and 10? Look at verses 9 and 10. What do they tell them that they do know about them? Okay. What he did in Egypt, and then what he did where? On the other side of the Jordan. They really were crafty, weren't they? You know what they conveniently left out of the description? Ai and Jericho. And yet the narrator's already told us that they did this because of Jericho and Ai. They said, oh, we've heard about the other side of the river, and we've heard about Egypt. Almost saying, we didn't heard anything about Jericho, we didn't heard anything about Ai. We're from a long ways away.
The same story Rahab told. I mean, we've heard of what you did with Sinai.
Right.
I mean, they're telling the same story that she told. So are they aware
Do they know Rahab?
that Rahab received mercy from Israel by telling this story, and they're repeating the same story?
Perhaps. And maybe even they hadn't even actually heard of Egypt. You know, they just heard that someone else heard of Egypt, and so they shared it. And they wanted this freedom, basically, of submission, so they could save their own lives. You know, if you go back and read, and we probably should do this, but we're not. I know that everyone in here is a diligent Bible student, so I would encourage you to go and read from Deuteronomy chapter 20, start in verse 10, and read through verse 18. You're going to find two distinct commands. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about the devoted thing and the accursed thing and why it was so treacherous for Achan to take what God had told him not to take. There were certain things and there were certain people that were devoted to destruction. It's the answer, although in our human mind sometimes isn't enough, it's the answer for why there was so much killing and why God authorized the destruction entirely of nations. But Exodus 20 Deuteronomy 20 makes it abundantly clear that there were only a certain segment of people that fell under the ban, that fell under this accursed list. And those people were to be destroyed. Earlier in the text, you start reading back in verse 10 of Deuteronomy 20, and he's going to say, if someone comes from a foreign nation, a foreign land, and offers peace, you can make peace with them. I don't know. Did they know that? Is that why they kept emphasizing, no, we're from further away than that. We're not part of the land. We're from a ways away. Somehow it seems they knew the distinction
maybe even better than some Israelites did, about God's law and about what God wanted. And so they insisted that they were not from where they seemed to be from and not where they thought they might be from, but they were certainly going to submit and be servants of theirs. Now, the Bible says in verse 12, this our bread was warm when we took our provisions out of our houses on the day that we left, but now it's become dry and crumbled. These wineskins, can you see this sort of on trial and presenting the evidence kind of scenario? Just touch it, just feel it. Just handle it a little bit. See, we're telling you the truth. You see, there are things that we can literally hold in our hand, that someone can present to us, and it looks real, it looks right, it sounds real, it sounds right, and it's a lie. Now, we pointed out, remember we pointed out about the destruction of Ai a few weeks ago? What's one of the common thoughts that's given that is the reason why God defeated them at Ai? We kind of try to debunk that because I don't think it's the actual truth. Remember, we talked about the fact that sometimes people will say, well, they didn't consult God. And because they didn't consult God, they went to fight Ai, and they only took a few men, that God destroyed them because he didn't consult them. And yet we pointed out, the Bible makes it clear that he defeated them because his wrath was kindled against them because of Achan. It wasn't because they didn't ask him. Now, had they asked him, maybe they would have learned about Achan's sin earlier and foregone that whole episode, but they didn't. But the Bible never says that they didn't ask God. But I want you to look at what it said here in our text. Somebody read verses 14 and 15. Chapter 9, 14 and 15, somebody.
Then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. So Joshua made peace with them, and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the rulers of the congregation swore to them.
All right, so now we know, right? In this instance, there's no debate. Why'd they fail? Didn't ask God. Now, I don't know what Joshua's heart was like. I don't know what the elders felt. But have you ever been in that situation where you had this gut feeling that something wasn't right? Someone kept trying to convince you that it was right, and you just didn't know what decision to make? You just didn't know where to turn? Listen, what I'm holding looks real. What I'm looking at feels right, but it just doesn't feel like this is the way it ought to be. Imagine having the perfect lifeline in that scenario. Having the perfect approach. The person who knows all the answers, and then not asking him. It just takes one prayer, right? It takes one counsel session with God and say, hey, here's the evidence. They could have even taken the bread to God and said, look, you can touch it, and you can hold it. Tell us what we ought to do. Give us instruction. But they didn't. And so, in an act of grace and an act of mercy, having been deceived, they made peace. And then what is the text going to say? How long does it take them to find out they were wrong? 3 days. 3 days go by. You know what the Bible doesn't tell us? It doesn't tell us how they found out. It doesn't. I don't know. I was thinking about an illustration of this pretend wilderness wandering concept. I'm talking in Hom 1 this quarter about using personal illustrations or about things that you're interested in, other people may not be interested in, and be careful about illustrations. But my favorite TV show of all time, history of TV, is a show called Lost. I don't know if you've seen it or not. Absolutely my favorite. But in that show, there are these other people who live near these individuals on the island who appear to be wilderness wanderers. When you first see them, they're barefoot, their clothes are ragged, they're disheveled. You come to find out, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, you should, but I'm going to tell you, that it was all makeup. They were highly sophisticated and trained. There was a lot of technology on the other side of that island they were lost on that would debunk the idea of these innocent, sort of depraved or deprived individuals, and when they find out, for some of them it's too late because they didn't know. I don't know how they found out. Did they pull out clean clothes and good clothes and start eating, good food and realize, oh no, we've made a mistake? I mean, 3 days is plenty enough time to go back to where they actually lived and show back up. But you know what? If God is known as a God who keeps His promises, what are you going to assume about God's people? They're going to keep their promises well. And so if God keeps His promises in that situation, then Israel's going to keep their promises. There's no need to keep the facade anymore. No reason to keep the lie going. We've already got the treaty. We've already got the deal. It's already been made. And so what happens in the rest of chapter 9 is that they're for it. Yet the people began to grumble against Joshua and the elders for making this decision. Does that not sound familiar with what Israel does? Now, I'm going to tell you, I think in the wilderness they were not justified in their grumbling. I'm going to give a little justification here. You were our leaders. You were appointed over us. You should have done something better than just accepted this deal. Now, the question always comes up, and again, I'm freely honest to admit this when I study passages like this, because we're not told. I would normally assume the reaction would be, listen, this covenant was made under false pretenses. You lied. You're not who you said you were. And so we have an obligation under the ban responsibility, the accursed responsibility to destroy you, and so we're going to destroy you. What do they do instead?
We took an oath, we got to keep our word.
Okay? Took an oath, we got to keep our word. Again, nowhere in the text does it say that they asked God what they should do. I don't know. Maybe they would have gotten the same answer. Maybe they did ask God and we're not told every detail of the story. Instead, they made them permanent servants, woodcutters and water drawers. They would serve God's people throughout the rest of the Old Testament. You're going to find references to what they did and how they served. So I guess I'll open the floor for another question then. What do you think should have been done? And if not what you think should have been done, why do you think they did what they did? And did God approve? I mean, that's 3 questions. We've only got 5 minutes. We're not even done with the text. What do you think about it?
I think they did what they did, maybe because they thought, well, yeah, we didn't confront God, we shouldn't have made this treaty, but a wrong isn't right or wrong. I guess
Okay.
they're thinking like, we can't break the treaty. Again, they didn't ask God.
They had sworn by the name of God, right? And it would seem that swearing by the name of God committed you that oath, even if you made it under false pretenses. And so maybe the honesty, integrity, morality aspect of it said, listen, we need to honor this. What else?
Well, even then, they didn't go to God and ask Him.
Right. So they perhaps failed again in getting that information. But God's reaction in chapter 10, to me, gives some indication that God was okay with their decision. Throwing hailstones to defend, because that's what happens, by the way. We only have a few minutes. That's what happens in chapter 10. So this southern coalition in chapter 10 begins to band together and says, okay, we saw what Gibeon did, so we're going to go defeat the Gibeonites. We're going to go fight them. Maybe we can't actually defeat Israel. We can defeat their extension, so let's go fight them. And guess what Gibeon does? They come to Joshua and said, hey, don't give up on us. You made a treaty. You promised us. Go fight with us. So when we picked up in chapter 10 and verse 7 a moment ago, that's Joshua getting the troops together to go defend the Gibeonites. And God throws hailstones and stops time, so the Gibeonites win their war through Joshua. So God seems at least to approve of the final result of it all. I would just say, this is my personal opinion, that God appreciated them honoring their commitment, even though they made it when they shouldn't have made it. It seems that way. Or else what God could have done is He could have destroyed the Gibeonites, other people of the land, and accomplished the same mission He wanted to accomplish that He couldn't get through Israel. He had that opportunity. He could have told Joshua, you stay away. You've honored your commitment by giving them a job, by you not killing them, but you don't have to step in to defend them. And yet God, through Joshua, actually defended them Himself.
The aspect of them coming to Joshua and basically in verse 26, he says, so you did this to me, 25. Now behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight, do to us, do it. They're asking for mercy
Okay? Well, they've already done that once, right? I mean, initially in coming, they were expecting to get mercy from Israel. They came back again expecting to get mercy from Israel. Again, to me, both of those instances tell me that they knew something reputation-wise about the God of heaven and about God's people before asking those two things. It also might be this sort of passive-aggressive way of approaching it. You know, whatever you think is right, but you know what you promised, right? You know what you said you would do. Whatever you think should be done, but you know what ought to be done. And so I think in all of these instances, there is an expectation of honoring a treaty, of honoring a commitment, of fulfilling to be done rather than this aggressive, militant response, which to me, it helps in my understanding. I told you from the very beginning, the book of Joshua is difficult for me because of all the killing, because of the annihilation of the people. And yet, right here in the middle, there's a nation that understands that peace can be made. So I think that's a powerful point about God and His people.
Is it possible that there's a lesson about covenant here that applies to God and His people that they understand? And that is, you know, when God makes His covenant with His people, even though His people break it, He keeps His part of the covenant. Are they echoing that same thing? You know, they've made a covenant, even though the Gibeonites technically did it under false pretenses. They've bound themselves to this agreement, just like God has, and God has always shown them mercy, even though they violate their part of the agreement. So they're going to keep their end of the deal because that's how God deals with it.
I think absolutely, and I think it plays right into the overall spirit and vein of this class, right? God keeps His promises. God's faithful. And God's people should ultimately emulate that character. What's the greatest character trait you can have? Forgiveness, faithfulness, integrity, honesty. I think all of that we should be a people that can be trusted to keep our word, that we can be honest. And again, if you're talking about the Gibeonites in a land of heathen nations, pagan worshipers, idol worshipers, they saw something different or heard something different about these people. I don't think it's a deal with the Canaanites or the Perizzites. You're destroyed. You lie to me. You make me enter a covenant falsely. I don't have to keep that. But God's people keep their word, even when they're at a loss, even when it hurts their reputation, even when it's not exactly what they want to do. That's what God's people do because that's what God does for us. Absolutely. Appreciate your attention and participation tonight. Enjoyed this chapter to me immensely.